I remember the night they burned the school because of the smell. Not smoke the way wood makes smoke. Not the clean carbon smell of something combusting, honestly. Something else underneath it. An adhesive compound the Vreth use in their compliance grenades. Something petrochemical and almost sweet that gets into your sinuses and stays there for weeks regardless of what you do. I washed my hair 3 times the following morning and could still bring it back. If I turned my face a certain way into the circulation vents, I can still bring it back now, years later if I try. I don't try often. My name is Gay. I was the 3rd ranked fighter in Sifu Dran's Hall, which means I was the 3rd best fighter in the Hao district, which in those years meant I was the 3rd best fighter on the entire station. It sounds like pride. It isn't. By the time this story is over, you'll understand that ranking 3rd was the only reason I'm alive to tell it. The school had existed for 31 years before the Vreth arrived. Sifu Dran had built it with his own hands, in the sense that the building was someone else's long before he arrived. But the thing inside the building, the practice, the discipline, the particular quality of silence that fell over the main chamber when students were working forms. That was entirely his construction, piece by piece, over 3 decades. I had been training under him since I was 9 years old. Koln's 2nd-ranked fighter, my brother in everything but blood, had started 2 years before me, which meant he'd been watching Sifu Dran longer than almost anyone. The school had been in trouble since the provisional compact arrived. That was 8 years before the burning. The Vreth sent a delegation first. 3 of them in those gray ceremonial wraps they wear when they're pretending to be diplomatic. All that pale gray silk folded precisely at the collar and wrist, moving through our district like they'd been here before and already knew how it ended. Long articulated fingers folded in that particular way they have when they want to project patience, the large dark eyes that never quite land on your face, always slightly above it, as if they're reading something written on your forehead that you can't see yourself. They spoke to Sifu Dran in the hall's main chamber while the rest of us pretended to train in the back. I was doing forms, but everyone was listening. The taller one, Compact Compliance Officer Yeth, his title was, and even the translation sounded like a threat, explained that the Vreth Compact's cultural harmonization protocols did not permit the operation of unregistered combat academies within jurisdictions under Compact stewardship. Ho District had come under Compact stewardship 14 months prior, when the old Colonial Commission signed the integration agreement and quietly stepped aside. We had not been consulted. There had been no vote, no announcement, nothing that resembled a conversation. One morning we woke up inside one arrangement, and by evening we were inside a different one, and the commission members who had signed the papers were already on transport ships to other postings. Yeth explained the harmonization protocols in careful, thorough detail. Every sentence built logically on the sentence before it. The Vreth have a quality in this kind of address, a precision in the construction of language that makes it almost impossible to locate the precise moment when what they're saying stops being reasonable and starts being something else entirely. By the end of it, he had explained why, in the interest of social stability, the continued operation of our school was problematic, and it had sounded almost sympathetic. Sifu Dran listened to all of it without moving. He was a small man, compact himself in an ironic way, with gray temples and hands that looked too large for his body, the kind of hands that accumulate small scars over decades and stop looking like anything other than tools. He let Yeth finish every word. He sat in the specific stillness that I recognized from the times he'd watched a student solve a problem the wrong way for the 3rd time in a row. Not impatient, not dismissive, just present and waiting. Then he said, in a voice with no heat in it, "We are a school. We teach discipline, health, and the old forms. We harm no one." Yeth explained that the forms themselves were the problem. Combat methodology not sanctioned by the Compact Harmonization Registry was categorically destabilizing, regardless of the intent with which it was practiced. A populace trained in unsanctioned physical resistance represented an actuarial risk to social cohesion. The phrase he used, I looked it up afterward, turning the translation over several times to make sure I had it right, was actuarial risk. The numerical likelihood of a bad outcome. We were a probability, not a school, Sifu Dran said. Come back when you have a lawful order. They left. We ran forms until nightfall, without speaking much. Vreth walked through the main chamber once the way he did at the end of a difficult day, adjusting a stance here, correcting a hand position there. He didn't address what had just happened. None of us asked him to. They came back 11 months later with the order. Hit grenade. The front wall of the school at the 3rd hour of the night watch. I was on the upper floor, on a sleeping mat, and the concussion of it brought me to my feet before I was fully conscious. Coln was already at the window, below us, in the orange light of the preliminary charge burning off the front wall. I could see 3 Vreth enforcement units and 2 local hire compliance assistants moving toward the building's main entrance. The second grenade hit before I had my boots on. Coln grabbed my arm and pulled me through the connecting room toward the back window. I remember looking over my shoulder as we moved, the doorway to the main chamber visible from that angle, the wall beyond it where Vreth kept the old practice scrolls, framed and mounted and yellowed with decades. The smoke from the grenades was already moving through the ventilation. I could smell it. That adhesive sweetness. I knew what it meant. Compliance grenades don't burn buildings. They saturate them with a chemical compound that, when inhaled at sufficient concentration, begins a neurological process the Compact calls voluntary cooperativity induction. After 3 hours in a compound-saturated space, you feel entirely reasonable about everything. We went out the back window, 2 floors down, into the maintenance alley. Coln hit the ground first and was already moving toward the service tunnel access before I landed. We were the only ones who made it that way. 2 junior students went out a side door, and the enforcement units were waiting for them in the alley. I saw it from 40 meters away as we moved. I kept moving. There was nothing else to do that wouldn't have gotten Coln and me taken as well. I don't know what happened to those 2 students. I never found out, and I eventually stopped asking because the people I asked began to look at me as if the question itself was dangerous, and it was. And that look from a person's eyes when they're calculating whether a sentence is going to get them processed. That look is almost as difficult to carry as the answer would have been. Fire burned for 4 hours. The school's interior was designed around wooden fittings. Vreth had always insisted on it, some principle about the quality of resonance in a space lined with living material. And once the compound ignited the walls, the fittings went fast. The outer structure remained standing. Compact issued a public notice the following day describing the incident as a compliance action against an unregistered hazard facility, effective termination of operating license, and notification of intent to remediate the space for approved use. They listed Vreth as detained pending reorientation review. They did not list where he was being held, or how long the review was expected to take. Coln and I lived rough for 6 weeks. I'll spare the particular details because they're not the point, but the picture is. Who kissed 2 men in their late 20s, who had spent most of their adult lives in a school that no longer existed. Moving through the levels of a station that had been steadily reorganizing itself around the question of how much compliance was enough compliance. Slept in service corridors and storage spaces, and twice in the back section of a food stall whose operator had known Vreth years before and didn't ask us questions. The How district in those years was not a place that encouraged the asking of questions or the drawing of official attention. The Compact's harmonization program was moving through the population in waves. Not the grenades. Those were for stubborn cases. Resistant nodes the surveys had identified, specific targets. The standard program was subtler, and in many ways harder to think about. You'd see a man you'd known for years. Someone with a particular quality of life in his face. Whatever it is that marks a person as someone who has specific opinions about things, and is not always wrong about them. And that quality would be gone. Not his personality exactly, not his intelligence, something under both of those things. The thing that makes a person want to push back against an arrangement that isn't right. The small interior resistance that keeps you from saying yes to everything that's presented to you as reasonable. Gone. He'd smile, he'd cooperate. He'd refer you to the appropriate Compact office for whatever problem you'd brought to him, and mean it genuinely. No malice, no fear, no awareness that something was different. The underground circuits were already running before we found them. They had to be. There were enough unprocessed people with enough restlessness and enough gray economy credits moving through the station to sustain them. The fighting happened in sealed lower-level spaces, old commercial processing floors converted by operators who knew how to avoid the compact's monitoring systems, fist rings, or ventilation. Crowds that watched in the particular silence of people who have learned that noise draws the wrong kind of attention. Forms. No tradition. No rules beyond the basic agreement that the match ended when one person couldn't continue. I won my first underground match because my opponent had been trained by the Compact's registered physical wellness program, which was exactly as deadly as it sounds. The registered curriculum produced graduates who could complete a fitness assessment and demonstrate basic joint lock sequences in a controlled environment, which is an entirely different preparation from being struck repeatedly by someone who is trying to stop you. I won my second match because the man across from me was larger than me and slower than me, and I had spent 11 years learning to understand what that difference meant in practice. By the 6th month, I was winning consistently. By the first anniversary of the school burning, I was the fighter the circuit operators used to close events. Last match, largest crowd, the one people made the effort to come down into the dark to see. Coln was the better fighter. We both knew it, and neither of us needed to say it. He had a quality that Sifu Dran used to describe in the old tongue, a phrase that translated roughly as the gift of arriving at the right moment, meaning he always seemed to understand where the fight needed him to be a half-second before anyone else had fully identified that location, as if he was reading the geometry of the space, not from where he stood, but from some neutral point above it. In a legitimate system, he would have been exceptional. In the underground, he was something that other fighters would watch from the side of the room and then quietly decide they had other obligations that evening. We heard about the compliance specialists after the 6th month underground, not the standard enforcement units. The Compact used those for physical interventions, for the burning of unregistered facilities, for the processing of identified targets. These were different. Vreth neurological technicians who circulated through public spaces in administrative cover, and who could implant a compliance seed in a person without that person knowing it had happened. The seed was not immediate. It would lie dormant in the subject's neurological system for weeks, sometimes 2 or 3 months, processing slowly below the threshold of detection. Then it would activate, and the person would stop, not injured, not afraid, not visibly altered in any way a stranger would notice. They would simply lose the interior connection to whatever had been driving them, and stand there with their hands at their sides while the world continued around them, cooperating entirely with the new arrangement. 3 fighters from our circuit went that way over the course of that year. Pellin was the one I knew best. He'd come out of the steel worker belts in the lower commercial tier, big and deliberate and capable of hitting with what felt like structural force when he committed to it. He stepped into a match he should have ended in 2 minutes, against a man he'd beaten twice before, and stood there in the center of the ring, with his arms relaxed at his sides, while the other man walked forward carefully, not entirely sure what was happening, and put him down. Pellin smiled throughout. The crowd went completely quiet in the way that crowds go quiet when they understand they're watching something that isn't really a fight anymore. The operator shut the card down immediately, and we all went home through different routes, not looking at each other on the way out. Coln and I started taking precautions after that, varied routes, changed housing every 3 weeks, stopped eating at venues where we couldn't observe the preparation, assessed every new person in the circuit against the question of whether they moved like someone who had been seated and was waiting for activation. It helped in the way that precautions help. It reduced the probability of a bad outcome without reducing it to 0, which is the honest accounting of most precautions. There were matches during those years that I think about still, not because of the result, but because of what they taught me about what I'd become. There was a man named Varric, in the 14th month underground, who had been a registered enforcement operative before he went off the Compact's grid, for reasons he never explained. and I never asked. He was built on a different scale than most of the circuit fighters. Not taller, but broader, in a way that changes the arithmetic of a fight, that moves the center of mass low, and makes takedowns easier, and absorption of impact a simple structural fact rather than a skill. The operator had put us together, expecting a short match. The crowd was thin that night, midweek, sparse lighting, the kind of event that existed mostly to keep the circuit alive, rather than to display anyone. I didn't care about the crowd. Varric fought without pattern, which was what the operator hadn't understood when he'd booked the card. Enforcement training doesn't produce stylized sequences. It produces a set of deeply embedded responses to specific inputs, and when those inputs don't come, the fighter has to improvise, which means you're dealing with a combination of trained reflexes and pure improvisation, and no predictable transitions between them. I'd never fought that before. The first exchange gave me a bloody nose and a broken rhythm and an education. We went 4 exchanges before I found the architecture. The improvised sections had a slight shoulder rise on the right side that preceded the decision to generate power, which meant the improvisations were actually consistent on that axis, even when nothing else was. The 4th exchange, I positioned everything around, waiting for the shoulder, and was already committed when it came. He went down hard enough that he didn't get up for a while. And when he did, he sat on the edge of the ring and looked at me with something that was not quite respect and not quite anger, and I didn't know the name for the specific combination. I thought about that fight later, in the storage sublevel, going over what I'd learned from it. The shoulder tell had been there from the first exchange. I'd been too focused on the irregularity of his patterns to see a consistency that ran underneath them. Sifu Dran had a principle for this. Something about how the eye that looks for complexity misses simplicity, and the eye that looks simplicity misses complexity, and the eye that simply watches without looking for anything in particular sees both. I'd been told this many times. I was beginning to understand what it meant. There was also a match I lost. The 18th month, an operator named Czech ran a venue in a former industrial cooling space on level 9, farther down than most of the circuit operated, which meant different clientele and a different quality of anonymity. Coln had cleared it through his own network assessment before I agreed to go. The fighter booked against me was registered as coming out of the outer ring settlements, someone who'd learned in an unaffiliated school that still operated under the compliance radar by virtue of being too small and too remote to rate a burning. I lost in the 3rd exchange, not to injury, not to deception. I simply got it wrong. The geometry I'd mapped from the first 2 exchanges was accurate, but I'd been matching tempo he'd set, rather than setting my own, which meant I was always one step behind the moment where the information was most useful. He found a position I hadn't protected, because I was still processing the previous transition, and put me down cleanly. I got up and we shook hands the way fighters do, when neither of them has anything to be angry about. Coln said nothing about it that night. In the morning he said, "You were following his pace." Yes, why? I thought about that for a longer time than it deserved. I was reading, not deciding. That was all, which was the Sifu Dran shorthand for, "You already know what to do about this, and I'm not going to take the understanding away from you by explaining it." I didn't lose another match in the underground for 11 months. In the 2nd year, the Compact announced the Registry Integration Initiative. All unregistered combat practitioners in How District had 60 standard cycles to present themselves to a harmonization center for evaluation and recertification under approved protocols. Practitioners who did not comply would face accelerated enforcement action. The announcement was broadcast on every public display in the district, in both Vreth notation and the local language. A bilingual courtesy the Compact only extended when they were very confident in the outcome. The circuit went dark for 2 weeks. Operators went quiet. Venues scattered. Cole and I spent most of those 2 weeks in a storage sublevel with 1 functioning heating unit and enough floor space to run forms in 4-meter increments if we adjusted the footwork. We ran them anyway, silently, in the dark in 4-meter intervals over and over, because Sifu Dran had told us once. During a session years before when a student had complained about repeating a particular form for the 100th time. that the forms were not about what you did with them in a fight. That was part of it, the surface part. The deeper part was what happened to you if you stopped. I thought about Sifu Dran a great deal in those 2 weeks. I thought about him the way you think about something when you're genuinely uncertain whether it still exists. He was being held in a reorientation facility on the outer processing ring. We knew that much through what remained of the information network. Reorientation meant a 4 to 8 week neurological adjustment program that left the subject cooperative, serene, and entirely disinterested in anything the compact classified as destabilizing. People emerged from it physically intact. They emerged with good color and calm voices and a genuine interest in helping the compact's local administrative staff understand what might be troubling their neighbors. That was the part that was difficult to sit with. Not the loss of the person, but the continued presence of the face saying the wrong things with a completely honest expression. The circuit reconstituted after 3 weeks, smaller and quieter. Fewer operators, tighter locations, crowds that were essentially the irreducible core of people who had decided that being processed was a worse outcome than the risk of not being processed. I went back to it because there was nothing else that made any sense. I won 4 matches in the first month back, and then 6 more in the 2 months after that, and I won them in a way I hadn't won before. Not performing for the room, not thinking about anything except the immediate geometry of the problem in front of me. Just solving. Sifu Dran would have recognized it. He might even have said something approving about it, which for him meant a slight nod and no critique at the end. There was a period of about 3 months during the second year when I stopped being sure what I was doing any of this for. Despair exactly, nothing that dramatic, more like a narrowing. The circuit existed, and I was in it and winning in it. And outside the circuit, the station was slowly reorganizing itself into the compact's preferred arrangement. And I couldn't see clearly what the relationship between those two facts was supposed to be. Why it mattered that I could put men down in a ring on level 9 when the processed population was expanding every month, and the people we'd lost weren't coming back. Coln asked me once what I was thinking. During those months, we were in the sub-level, late, after a night card had wrapped, and we were waiting for the corridor traffic to thin before we moved. Whether this is worth it, I said. He didn't answer immediately. He was quiet, long enough that I thought he'd decided not to answer at all, which was a thing he did when the question was one he thought I needed to sit with longer. Then he said, "Do you remember the forms Sifa ran on the last night, before the burning?" I did. He had come through the main chamber at the end of the session and run the oldest sequence, the first one he'd seen any of us. The foundational one, the one that looks almost too simple to be worth the time, but that you run 10,000 times before you understand what it's actually for. He'd run it alone without cooing anyone else at his own pace until it was done. Then he'd said goodnight and gone upstairs. He knew something was coming, I said. Maybe. Or maybe he just ran the forms because it was the end of the day. Coln leaned his head back against the wall. Either way, he ran them. I thought about that for a long time. I kept going. It was Coln who made contact with Sela. She had been working as an administrative coordinator in the Compact's local compliance division for 2 years, when Coln found her through a mutual point in the circuit network. Someone who moved between the administrative world and the underground world in the particular way that some people manage, quietly, for as long as they can sustain it. Sela had gone to work for the Compact early, during the integration period, because it was a job. And the How district was a place where having a job was better than not having one. And because people in compact administrative roles were not subject to the standard harmonization process, the compact preferred its local administrative staff unprocessed. Processed administrators became too agreeable. They lost the capacity to flag problems before those problems required escalation. The compact needed people who could still tell the difference between a manageable situation and one that was becoming unmanageable. Sela had a daughter who was 3 years old. The Compact had released a policy addendum in the current cycle's administrative circular batch. Buried in the middle of a routine updates document, 78 items long, formatted in the Vreth administrative style that compressed complex implications into brief standardized language. Noting that the integration initiative's second phase would include age-adjusted harmonization protocols for dependent minors of non-compliant household units. Sela had read the circular 3 times, over 2 days before she was certain she understood what that sentence meant. She wanted 2 things: safe passage out of compact jurisdiction for herself and her daughter, and someone who could use what she knew. In exchange, she would give us access to information from inside the compliance division. Schedules, facility locations, the details of whatever the compact was planning for the underground circuits. We met her once, the 3 of us, in a maintenance junction on level 4. She was shorter than I'd expected, and carried herself with the particular stillness of someone who has spent 2 years learning to move through spaces without drawing attention. She told us what she knew is in the efficient sequential way of someone who had organized the information carefully before arriving, and was not going to waste time now that the moment had come. Sifu Dran was alive. He had not been fully processed. Compliance Officer Yeth had kept him in a partial suspension state, not mercy. She was clear about that. Yeth didn't have that register, but because the compact had a use for him, there had been a plan in development for some time. The burning of the school, the underground circuits, the continued tolerance of the illegal fighting networks. All of it had been deliberate. The compact had known about the circuits from the beginning. They had allowed them to continue running because they needed them running. They needed them to produce a fighter. The Vreth Compact had a problem in the outer harmonization perimeter, which included How District and 12 adjoining settlements. The integration model had been presented to the broader compact sphere, the Council Worlds, the Allied Systems, the Harmonization Oversight Bureau, as a demonstration of willing harmonization. A case study. This is how the process works. The district comes in, the population adjusts, social stability improves, everyone is better off. Other systems look at the model and understand that integration is beneficial and not coercive. That was the intended reading. The actual reading, from several council delegations who had been monitoring How District carefully, was different. Too fast, some delegations had said in formal session. The pace of processing was inconsistent with voluntary adoption. Compliance statistics were not credible as natural uptake. The Harmonization Oversight Bureau had opened a review. Yes, solution was the kind of thing that made me understand why the Vreth were genuinely dangerous. Not because they were brutal, but because they were clever, and their cleverness had no floor under it. No point at which the logic of a plan collided with something they were unwilling to do. A championship match. Open arena, sanctioned event, broadcast on the interstellar record to every council world in the harmonization perimeter. On one side, the Compact's certified combat champion, produced by the registered wellness program, trained under approved methodology, representing everything the Compact was arguing their system produced. On the other side, the best fighter the illegal underground circuits had to offer. The resistance, the holdouts, the people who had refused harmonization and kept fighting in the dark. If the Compact's champion won, on record, witnessed by every delegation that had raised concerns, it would demonstrate definitively that the registered system was superior, that the old ways were not just unsanctioned, but genuinely less effective, that integration worked, that the harmonization model produced better outcomes, and that the Oversight Bureau's concerns were the anxious second-guessing of councils who had not yet seen the data. Case closed, objections noted and answered, and if the underground fighter won, Yeth had Sifu Dran, the reorientation process would complete overnight. While the broadcast was still running, the fighter's teacher, his school's entire living tradition, would be gone by the time the last feed cut out. There was no version of this arrangement in which the Compact had not already won something. I sat with Coln in the storage sub-level for a long time after Sela left. The heating unit ticked. The ventilation somewhere deeper in the structure made its usual low sounds. Was thinking about all the ways this was not survivable and coming up with the same number each time. They take Sifu either way, Colin said. Yes, unless, he let the word sit there for a moment. Unless the win is fast enough and complete enough that by the time it's over, The council delegations have already transmitted their objections, and Yeth has a political problem that's larger than one man in a detention room. And unless someone moves on Sifu simultaneously, while every compact officer on this station is watching the broadcast. I looked at him. Both things at the same time, he said. Sela gets to the facility. I handle the access. She's told me enough about the processing ring layout that I can work the service entrance routing. Fight. You win fast, and you win in a way the record can't be edited around. They'll put you in the match, I said. You're the better fighter. He looked at me, something in his face that I hadn't seen there before, or hadn't let myself see. No, they've already selected. Sela confirmed it before she left the meeting. It's you. I stared at him. I've been managing my visibility in the circuit for 8 months, he said, with the particular flatness of tone that meant he was not going to apologize for this, but he was going to be entirely honest about it, losing carefully when the results were being observed, staying off the operator's feature cards. Compact's talent analysts have been watching the circuit. Sela told me that months ago, and I made sure that what they found when they looked was you, the third-ranked fighter who became the best fighter underground, the story they needed. I thought about what to say to that, and didn't find anything immediate. Since Pelin, he said, since I understood what shape the plan had. The arena was the old freight certification warehouse on level 7 of the outer processing ring. The Compact had cleaned it and rigged it for the occasion. Proper ring at the center, broadcast equipment ringing the upper walls on 4 sides, seating for approximately 300 witnesses, installed in stepped rows around the ring space. The ceiling ran 30 meters overhead, and the Vreth standard lighting, harsh blue-white, drained the warmth from everything, and made the whole space feel like the interior of a machine that was about to do something to you. I arrived 3 hours before the match, which was always how Sifu Dran had taught us to approach any significant event. You arrive when there's nothing happening yet, because nothing happening is the state in which you can learn the room honestly. I walked the perimeter of the ring space. I learned the floor, where the surface was fractionally uneven, where a scuff mark indicated a drainage point, where the metal grating of the ventilation inlets ran close to the edge of the ring's lower padding. I studied the lighting rig positions and identified the 2 angles where a fighter facing the wrong direction would have the overhead blue-white directly in their visual field. I noted the distance from the ring edge to the broadcast equipment stands and the likely angle of operator movement during an extended match. The Compact officials watching me do this seemed to find it methodical in a slightly tedious way. I let them think whatever they wanted to think. The Compact's champion arrived 90 minutes before the match time. His name was Drival. He was a local human from the How district itself originally. The broadcast's framing would make a great deal of that detail, I knew. 32 years old, 12 years of certified wellness program training. He came in without spectacle, walked the ring space with a brief, focused attention, and then positioned himself at the far end to warm up. I watched him from my end while I ran my own preparation. He was not what the lower-tier program produced. That was the first thing I had to account for. He could actually move. Not in the way of someone who had been taught movement by people who understood movement, but in the way of someone who had a natural quality of balance that the program had managed not to destroy. He understood distance. He kept his warm-up to compact, efficient sequences rather than the extended demonstrative routines I'd seen other compact graduates use, which told me he knew the difference between preparation and performance. And he watched me with the quality of a man who was taking in information rather than making assessments. He wasn't deciding I was beatable. He was watching to understand what he was dealing with. I respected that. It made the problem harder. The delegations arrived 40 minutes before the scheduled time. Yeth in the front tier, formal gray ceremony wrapping, the kind you wore when the event was being transmitted to the council worlds, and you wanted the transmission to reflect a certain kind of authority. On either side of him, 2 members of the Tal Saren block, the Outer Ring Commission observers. And in the seat I'd been told to look for, a senior representative from the Harmonization Oversight Bureau itself, the Bureau, the body that had opened the review, the body whose opinion, in practice, determined whether the Compact's integration model in Hod District was a demonstration or a cautionary example. Yet built these stakes himself, I realized then. He had invited the highest possible audience because he was that confident. Because the plan accounted for every variable he could identify, and the Vreth are very good at identifying variables. And he had done this work carefully over 2 years, and he was certain. I thought about seafood dran. I thought about the smell of the compliance grenades. I thought about Pellin standing in the ring with his hands at his sides. I thought about forms in 4-meter intervals in the dark. Then I stopped thinking about all of it. Because the match was beginning, and the only thing in the room that was real was the 17.5 feet between me and Drevel. He came in measured. Not slow, he wasn't stalling, but controlled, feeling the distance, keeping his weight centered and his guard honest. The registered program had given him clean fundamentals. The guard position wasn't performing anything. It was actually functional. The footwork was efficient rather than elaborate. I circled through the first exchange and we both withheld. The broadcast commentator described this as cautious. Shh. It wasn't caution. You don't know who you're fighting until you've given them something unexpected and seen how they handle it. What I was doing was reading the room he'd grown up in. Shh. The way a man moves in the first 20 seconds of a fight against someone he doesn't know tells you almost everything about what he was taught to be afraid of. Drevel wasn't afraid of much, which was useful to know. I threw a low combination with a concealed second strike, and Drevel read the setup and moved into me, rather than away, which was the correct response against a low sweep, and told me someone with genuine analytical intelligence had been coaching him on reading setups. He caught the second strike on a forearm block with solid weight behind it. The contact told me more than a clean miss would have. He had structural integrity in his defensive positions, not just placement. Crowd made a sound I couldn't fully interpret. The bureau observer leaned slightly forward. What I felt, honestly, was respect. The unwelcome kind you feel when the problem turns out more serious than you'd been hoping. I adjusted the internal calculation and kept moving. The second exchange was faster, and he pressed the initiative. His combinations were technically precise but slightly patterned in their sequencing. The curriculum's limitation, the one that all curricula have at the advanced levels, which is that forms teach responses and responses can be read once you have enough exchanges to map them. I let 2 strikes land at ranges where they cost me nothing essential. I wanted him confident in the pattern. I wanted him to arrive at the 5th movement in that particular sequence, with the conviction that it was working, that he'd found something real, that he understood what I was doing. Seafood Dran had spent years teaching us this. Not as strategy exactly, more as an understanding of how a fight is actually structured, how a human being processes information under pressure, and what that processing does to their decisions. The moment you make someone believe they've found something, they stop looking for anything else. It's not deception. It's letting them deceive themselves, which is faster and more durable. You don't have to maintain it. They maintain it for you. In the third exchange, he found the pattern and accelerated into it. I felt the tempo shift. Felt it the way you feel a change in a machine sound before the machine itself changes anything visible. And when he committed, I stepped off the line he'd been constructing, broke the pattern at the point he was most certain of it, and put 3 years of underground fighting into the follow-through, at an angle his guard hadn't been built to cover. I was thinking of Varric and the shoulder tell. I was thinking of the 18th month, and the loss I'd taken from following someone else's pace. I was thinking of nothing at all, which is where all of that thinking eventually gets you. He went down to one knee, and he stayed there, for a breath longer than a man who is fully present stays down, and the room went completely silent. The broadcast equipment hummed. The ventilation in the 30-meter ceiling moved air through the warehouse in slow cycles. He got up. I want to be honest about that. He got up and looked at me with something that was not anger and not fear and not defeat. Something more like recalibration. The look of a man who has just been given accurate new information and is integrating it. He adjusted his guard and came back into the distance, and we both understood that this had become a different match than the one either of us had started with. Fourth exchange told me the rest of what I needed to know about him. He was fighting because he believed in what he was doing, not because the compact had told him to. He had been given a version of the same thing I'd been given. A teacher, a practice, years of serious work done in a room with a floor that had the specific quality of floors in rooms where serious work is done. And he had made different choices in a different set of circumstances. And the result was standing across from me with a good guard and a revised game plan, and the quality of someone who would give me everything he had until there was nothing remaining to give. That is the hardest kind of fight. Not because of the physical difficulty, though that is real and should not be minimized, because you can't locate any hatred for it. You can't be angry at the person across from you in any way that would fuel something. You just have to solve the problem as cleanly and as completely as possible. And you have to do it in a room full of people who need this to take a long time, watched by delegations from worlds whose good opinion of the compact depended on the outcome, broadcast live to every system in the harmonization perimeter. I needed it to be brief. Those two facts were in tension, and the tension had to be managed. The fifth exchange and the sixth were the longest portions of the match, and both were his best work. He was adapting, which I had expected, but he was adapting faster than I'd modeled, and in directions that were not fully predictable from the curriculum's standard response tree, which meant he had something in him that the program hadn't installed. Improvisation, judgment, the capacity to make decisions mid-sequence, rather than executing a stored pattern to its conclusion. Priest. The underground had taught me to fight people with that quality. The registered program apparently produced it in their best graduates as an emergent property, whether they'd intended to or not. I acknowledged this internally and kept working. I was looking for, through those two long exchanges, was the thing underneath the adaptation. Everyone has it. Patterns that predate the training, the movement tendencies that were installed so early, they're no longer technique, but anatomy. Drival's adaptations were good, but they all ran on the same underlying chassis, and the chassis had been built by someone before any coach got to it. I was mapping it the way I'd mapped the cooling space fighter in the 18th month, the way I'd mapped Varek, the way 3 years of underground circuit work had taught me to map. Not by looking for what was there, but by removing everything I'd already accounted for and seeing what remained constant. I found it in the sixth exchange. A lateral weight transfer on the right side that preceded guard, repositioning by a consistent interval, natural to him, not coached, just the way his body had learned to move through that particular transition at some point in his development. The interval was approximately a quarter second. It opened the center during transitions to his dominant side attacks. Quarter second is not nothing. In a warehouse, some levels, broadcast to 7 feeds and 300 witnesses and the delegations of 4 council worlds, with Coln moving through the service entrance routing of the outer processing ring, and Sella's daughter waiting in whatever temporary space they'd arranged. A quarter second was the entire argument. The 7th exchange was brief. I drove the tempo up past the point where his adaptive capacity could keep pace, put direct pressure on the transition sequence until it was forced on his timetable rather than mine. And when the weight transfer came, I was already committed. He went down to the ring floor, and the stillness in him was complete and final. And this time he stayed there, and the warehouse was completely silent, and on 7 broadcast feeds to every system that Yeth had invited to watch his demonstration. The record showed the floor of a freight certification facility and 1 man from a burned school standing upright, and 1 certified compact champion who was not. 300 compact officials and council delegation observers sat in silence. On 7 broadcast feeds, to every system in the harmonization perimeter, the record showed the floor of a freight warehouse of level 7 of the outer processing ring, and a certified compact champion. 12 years of registered approved training, the product of the integrated wellness system, the evidence for the model, lying still while a man from an illegal school that had been burned down 3 years ago stood over him. I was aware, in the peripheral way that you're aware of things, when the focused part of your attention is on something else, that Yeth was already on his feet, that the Bureau observer was speaking urgently, into a communications device and had been for some seconds already, which meant whatever process was happening at the council level had started before the match was officially concluded, that the Talsarin delegates were in close consultation in the particular posture of people who have just watched a problem become someone else's problem and are now calibrating how far to stand from it, that the Outer Ring Commission observer was making a recording into his own device, a personal record separate from which I could only interpret as someone preserving documentation they expected to use later in an environment where the official record might be disputed. Cella, the outer processing ring, the facility now. There was nothing I could do about any of that, from the floor of a warehouse. Either the plan had worked or it hadn't. The Compact officials did not approach me immediately after the match. They were too much difficulty with each other. The kind of urgent internal communication that happens when a situation requires immediate senior decisions, and the senior decision-makers are all in the same room discovering simultaneously that they have no consensus about what the decision should be. I stood in the ring and waited, because there was nowhere better to be, and because leaving would have required moving past the Compact officials, and I wanted to understand the room before I moved through it. What I understood, watching Yeth manage the delegations for 20 minutes, while I stood in a ring in the middle of the warehouse. The plan had worked at the level that mattered. The Bureau observer had filed something during the match itself. The Talsarin block had separated from Yeth's immediately and was communicating with someone off-station. The event had been designed to produce a record that confirmed the Compact's model. Instead, it had produced a record that contradicted it, and the record was already in transit to the Council worlds on 7 different feed channels, and there was no version of that record that Yeth could edit or suppress before it arrived. Coln came through the service entrance on the north side of the warehouse 23 minutes after the match ended, moving at the controlled pace of someone who has been running and has not yet permitted themselves to stop entirely. Sifu Dran was with him, slightly behind, one hand resting lightly on Coln's shoulder. Not for support exactly, more the way you touch something to confirm it's real. The old man looked different than I remembered him, thinner, with a quality of careful attention to each step that suggested his proprioceptive system was still relearning something the partial suspension had disturbed. His shoulders were pulled slightly forward, which was not how he'd carried himself before. Sifu Dran had always stood with his back straight regardless of circumstances. A quality of occupying space confidently that I'd never had to think about, because it was simply always there. Forward shoulder was new. It would correct, I thought. It would correct in time, but his eyes were clear. That was the thing I was looking for, and it was there. Particular quality of his attention. The way he could be entirely present in a room without performing presence, without indicating that he was paying attention, simply paying it, was intact. Whatever the partial suspension had done or begun to do, it hadn't reached that. He looked at me for a long moment. He looked at the ring. He looked at Coln and then back at me. The warehouse was still full of Compact officials, in various stages of crisis management, and none of them were paying any attention to 3 people standing at the edge of the ring space, because the crisis management was happening in the tiers and at the broadcast stations and in the communications channels. And 3 people standing quietly near a ring in a room were not the crisis. Then he said, "Your left guard was too wide in the 4th exchange." I laughed. It came out rougher than I intended. The kind of laugh that carries more than humor in it. That carries the thing you've been not carrying for 3 years, because there was no room to put it down. "I know," I said. He had an angle and chose not to use it. "The next opponent will use it." "I know." Coln put his hand briefly on my shoulder, once, then was quiet, which was exactly right. We stayed in the warehouse for another 40 minutes while the Compact finished its crisis management. And then we left through the service entrance the way we'd come in, and nobody stopped us. Because the Compact had larger problems than 3 people walking out a side door on level 7. The Harmonization Oversight Bureau filed a formal inquiry within 48 standard hours. The Talsaran bloc submitted a suspension recommendation on the integration initiative's second phase 4 days later. Compliance processing program in How District slowed, then stalled, then stopped generating new orders while the review was pending. An outcome the compact characterized publicly as an administrative pause pending regulatory clarification, but which in practical terms meant no new processing, no new enforcement actions, no new compliance grenades in the night. For the foreseeable duration of a council review that Yeth had not planned to be managing, his models had not included this outcome. The Vreth are excellent at modeling outcomes they've considered. The problem is the boundary around the set of outcomes they've considered. Yeth was recalled to a senior review board on the Compact's central administrative world 6 weeks after the match. Recall was described as routine consultation. It was not routine consultation. Because Sela had a contact inside the Bureau Observer's office who relayed the summary of the initial inquiry findings 3 months later. By which point Sela was 3 systems away, and the summary reached us through a network of people passing careful information through routes. The Compact's monitoring systems were not adequately designed to track. Sela and her daughter were 3 systems away before any of the formal proceedings began. That was the only part of the plan that had worked exactly as designed, without improvisation or luck, or the particular mercy of someone making a decision a quarter second before it needed to be made. The school never reopened. I want to be clear about that, because there's a version of this kind of story where everything returns to what it was, where the thing that was lost comes back intact, and I owe it to the truth to say that version isn't this one. The hall was burned. The practice scrolls were ash. The students who had been processed were still processed. The Compact's neurological work didn't reverse itself because of a broadcast or a council inquiry. The people we'd lost along the way didn't come back. Colmes understood this reality before I was fully ready to accept it, which was consistent with the way he'd always understood things. What you can do. What Sifu Dran told us in those weeks after, when we had the space to think again, is carry what you were given. You don't carry the building. You don't carry the sign over the door or the framed scrolls on the walls or the certificate from whatever registry might have sanctioned you. You carry the practice itself, the knowledge, the particular understanding of how a body moves and what it's capable of, and you pass it forward to whoever is willing to receive it, in whatever space is available, without any of the formal apparatus that makes a thing official. Sifu Dran taught for 11 more years, in living quarters mostly, in storage spaces and maintenance corridors, and the back sections of establishments whose operators owed him something, or simply understood what he was doing, and chose not to notice it. Small groups, no records, the old forms running in whatever floor space was available, adapted to 4 meters or 6 meters, or whatever the room permitted. I assisted him for all 11 years. So did Colm. We were not rebuilding the school. That's not the right description of it. The school was a specific thing that existed in a specific place and is gone. What we were doing was something without a better name than the thing itself. The practice continuing, passed from one person to the next, in the particular way that things survive when the institutions that were supposed to carry them have been removed. Hidden exactly. Not underground, the way the Cirque once were underground, just quiet, present, available to whoever looked for it. The Vreth don't have a word for that, which is perhaps the clearest explanation of why they never fully understood what they were dealing with in How District. Their language contains extensive vocabulary for compliance and resistance, for registered and unregistered, for sanctioned and unsanctioned. They do not have the language for the thing that simply continues past all of those categories, past resistance, past defiance, past the point where any strategic calculation supports continuing, because it is not continuing for strategic reasons. It's continuing because a man told you once that the forms are not about what you do with them in a fight. They're about what happens to you if you stop. I think about the warehouse sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. Usually when I'm moving through a sequence I've run 10,000 times and I arrive at a particular transition, and something in the movement carries the memory the way a smell can carry a memory. The silence after Dravel went down. 7 feeds broadcasting to the council worlds. Yeth standing with his arms at his sides in a room where the plan he'd spent 2 years building had just inverted itself on live transmission. 300 officials, who had come to watch a demonstration, and were now watching a political problem, materialize in real time. The arithmetic was simple. One man from a burned school, carrying what the burned school had given him, solving the problem in front of him the way the burned school said you solved problems. Not through the larger system. Not through the approved apparatus. Not through anything that could be registered or certified or filed against a risk calculation. Through what had been given to him by a small man with large hands who had been teaching in that hall for 31 years before they burned it. That's what went down the Compact's champion. Not me. Not Coln's planning. Not Sela's information. What the hall had put into me over 11 years of serious work, which is the only thing that survives a compliance grenade and a burning school, and 3 years in the underground circuits. The only thing they couldn't saturate out of the air, or process out of a person's nervous system, because it isn't in the nervous system. It's deeper than that. It's the 10,000th repetition of a form in a room that no longer exists. I know what I'm doing when I move through the old sequences now. I know what I'm passing forward and what it costs, and what it's worth. Sifu Dran knew it for 31 years before any of us were students. The hall knew it before he arrived. Some things you don't lose, because you can't find them to take them. You stay ready. That's the whole of it. You stay ready.